British serial killer Harold Shipman, who worked in England as a clinical specialist, killed north of 200 of his patients before his capture in 1998. Harold Shipman went to Leeds School of Medicine and started functioning as a doctor in 1970. Among them, at that point, and his capture in 1998, he killed something like 215 and conceivably upwards of 260 of his patients, infusing them with deadly dosages of pain relievers. Conceived the center youngster into a common family on January 14, 1946, Harold Frederick Shipman, known as Fred, was the most loved offspring of his overbearing mother, Vera. She ingrained in him an early feeling of prevalence that polluted the greater part of his later connections, leaving him a confined juvenile with few companions. Whenever his mom was determined to have terminal cellular breakdown in the lungs, he enthusiastically managed her consideration as she declined, captivated by the beneficial outcome that the organization of morphine had on her affliction, until she capitulated to the sickness on June 21, 1963. Crushed by her passing, not entirely set in stone to go to clinical school, and he was owned up to Leeds University Clinical School for preparing 2 years after the fact, having bombed his selection tests first time, prior to serving his medical clinic temporary job. Still an introvert, he met his future spouse, Primrose, at 19 years old, and they were hitched when she was 17, and 5 months pregnant with their first youngster. By 1974, he was a dad of 2 and had joined a clinical practice in Todmorden, Yorkshire, where he at first flourished as a family specialist, before supposedly becoming dependent on the pain reliever pethidine. He manufactured solutions for a lot of the medication, and he had to leave the training when gotten by his clinical partners in 1975, when he entered a medication recovery program. In the resulting request, he got a little fine and a conviction for fabrication. A couple of years after the fact, Shipman was acknowledged onto the staff at Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, where he charmed himself as a diligent specialist, who partook in the trust of patients and associates the same, despite the fact that he had gained notoriety for egotism among junior staff. He stayed on staff there for very nearly 20 years, and his conduct caused just minor interest from other medical services experts. The nearby funeral director saw that Dr. Shipman's patients appeared to be passing on at a curiously high rate, and displayed comparable postures in death. Most were completely dressed, and typically sitting up or leaning back on a settee. He was concerned to the point of moving toward Shipman about this straightforwardly, who consoled him that nothing remained to be worried about. Afterward, another clinical associate, Dr. Susan Booth, likewise observed the comparability upsetting, and the neighborhood coroner's office was alarmed, who then reached the police. A secretive examination followed, however Shipman was cleared, as it gave the idea that his records were all together. The request neglected to contact the General Medical Council, or check criminal records, which would have yielded proof of Shipman's past record. Afterward, a more careful examination uncovered that Shipman adjusted the clinical records of his patients to prove their reasons for death. Taking cover behind his status as a mindful, family specialist, it is inordinately difficult to lay out precisely when Shipman started killing his patients, or without a doubt precisely the number of passed on at his hands, and his disavowal, all things considered, never really helped the specialists. Without a doubt, his killing binge was simply finished up because of the assurance of Angela Woodruff, the girl of one of his casualties, who wouldn't acknowledge the clarifications given for her mom's demise. Kathleen Grundy, a functioning, rich 81-year-old widow, was tracked down dead in her home on June 24, 1998, following a previous visit by Shipman. Woodruff was prompted by Shipman that a post-mortem examination was not needed, and Grundy was covered as per her girl's desires. Woodruff was an attorney, and had generally taken care of her mom's undertakings, so it was with some unexpected that she found that another will existed, passing on the majority of her mom's bequest to Dr. Shipman. Woodruff was persuaded the record was a fraud, and that Shipman had killed her mom, producing the will to profit from her demise. She alarmed the neighborhood police, where Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles immediately reached a similar resolution upon assessment of the proof. Grundy's body was unearthed, and a posthumous uncovered that she had passed on from a morphine glut, controlled in something like 3 hours of her demise, exactly inside the time span of Shipman's visit to her. Shipman's house was struck, yielding clinical records, an odd assortment of gems, and an old typewriter which ended up being the instrument whereupon Grundy's fashion will had been delivered. It was promptly evident to the police, from the clinical records seized, that the case would broaden farther than the single passing being referred to, and need was given to those passings that would be generally useful to research, to be specific casualties who had not been incinerated, and who had kicked the bucket following a home visit by Shipman, which were given need. Shipman had asked families to incinerate their family members in an enormous number of cases, focusing on that no further examination of their demises was essential, even in examples where these family members had passed on from makes already obscure the families. In circumstances where they brought up issues, Shipman would give automated clinical notes that authenticated his reason for death proclamations. Police later settled that Shipman would, much of the time, change these clinical notes straightforwardly subsequent to killing the patient, to guarantee that his record matched the chronicled records. What Shipman had neglected to get a handle on was that every modification of the records would be time-stepped by the PC, empowering police to discover precisely which records had been adjusted. Following broad examinations, which incorporated various exhumations and postmortems, the police accused Shipman of 15 individual counts of homicide on September 7, 1998, as well as 1 count of phony. Shipman's preliminary initiated in Preston Crown Court on October 5, 1999. Endeavors by his safeguard committee to have Shipman attempted in 3 separate stages, for example cases with actual proof, cases without in the Grundy situation, where the imitation separated it from different cases, as well as to have dooming proof connecting with Shipman's fake gathering of morphine and different medications, were tossed out, and the preliminary continued on the 16 charges remembered for the arraignment. The indictment declared that Shipman had killed the 15 patients since he appreciated practicing command over life and demise, and excused any cases that he had been acting sympathetically, as his casualties were generally not experiencing a terminal disease. Woodruff showed up as the primary observer. Her frank way and record of her unremitting assurance to get to reality intrigued the jury, and endeavors by Shipman's safeguard to subvert her were generally fruitless. Then, the public authority pathologist drove the court through the abhorrent posthumous discoveries, where morphine harmfulness was the reason for death in many occasions. From there on, unique mark investigation of the fashioned won't show that Grundy had ever taken care of the will, and her mark was excused by a penmanship master as an unrefined phony. A police PC expert then affirmed how Shipman had modified his PC records to make side effects that his dead patients never had, generally speaking not long after their demises. As the preliminary advanced on to different casualties and the records of their family members, the example of Shipman's way of behaving turned out to be much more clear. An absence of sympathy, negligence for the desires of going to family members and hesitance to endeavor to resuscitate patients were adequately awful. However, one more extortion additionally became visible. He would claim to call the crisis administrations within the sight of family members, then counteract the call when the patient was found to be dead. Phone records showed that no genuine calls were made. At long last, proof of his medication storing was presented, with bogus recommending to patients who didn't need morphine, over-endorsing to other people who did, as well as verification of his visits to the homes of the as-of-late perished to gather up unused medication supplies for removal. Shipman's haughty attitude all through the preliminary never really helped his protection in illustrating a devoted medical services proficient. Regardless of their endeavors, his presumption and continually evolving stories, when gotten out in clear lies, never really charmed him to the jury. Following a fastidious summation by the adjudicator, and a wariness to the jury that nobody had really seen Shipman kill any of his patients, the jury were adequately persuaded by the declaration and proof introduced, and collectively viewed Shipman to be blameworthy on all charges, 15 counts of homicide and 1 of imitation, on the evening of January 31, 2000. The appointed authority passed 15 life sentences, as well as a 4-year sentence for fabrication, which he drove to an entire life sentence, actually eliminating any chance of parole. Shipman was detained at Durham Prison. The way that a specialist had killed 15 patients sent a shiver through the clinical local area. However, this was to demonstrate irrelevant considering further examinations that dug all the more profoundly into his patient case list history. A clinical review led by Professor Richard Baker, of the University of Leicester, inspected the number and example of passings in Shipman's training and contrasted them and those of different professionals. It observed that paces of death among his older patients were essentially higher, bunched at specific seasons of day, and that Shipman was in participation in an excessively big number of cases. The review proceeds to gauge that he might have been answerable for the passings of something like 2